All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, y'all, introducing Jeffrey Kaye, our old friend and great reporter, a retired psychologist, and author of Cover Up at Guantanamo. And he's got this great new one at Medium. It's Jeff-Kaye with a Y.medium.com. Secret Plan Revealed. CIA told to destroy those supporting communist germ warfare myth. Welcome back to the show. How you doing, Jeff?
Hey, Scott. Thanks very much. I'm doing great. I hope you're doing good, too. I'm happy to be here.
Great, man. Good to talk to you again. And another just knock 'em dead piece from you here on America's biological war in Korea. Now, so what we're talking about here is the plan that was eventually implemented, I guess, to smear and destroy anyone who said that it was true that America used biological warfare in the Korean War. So can we rewind a step and start with how you know that it's really true and not just a bunch of commie propaganda? Because, of course, the KGB made up all kinds of lies and forged documents and did all kinds of things to wage, you know, they're part of the propaganda war against the United States during the Cold War. And that sounds just like a commie thing to do, would be to pretend that America would do such a dastardly thing, right?
Right. Well, that's certainly, and don't forget the brainwashing of the pilots.
That's right, the Manchurian candidates.
The Manchurian candidate. And in a way, that's where this starts for me, because I was trying to track down years ago these brainwashed confessions, because I wanted to see them. I just wanted to see how fantastic and outlandish they were. I wanted to compare them to the confessions happening in Guantanamo, the CIA black sites, because, you know, the New York Times was telling me these false confessions were predicated and rather created in the same manner in which the Chinese commies had forced false confessions of the use of biological warfare during the Korean War. This has been repeated over and over again. I'm sure many of your listeners have even heard that. I believed it myself. I said, okay, that's not, originally I just said, let me just see the confessions. See, I had a personal interest and a professional interest, if you will, because some of your listeners may know, I was working with torture victims at the time. At least part of my psychology practice was involved in the assessment and sometimes psychotherapy with torture victims who had come to the United States, not torture victims of the United States, but from a multitude of different countries around the world. They'd come to a treatment center in San Francisco called Survivors International, and there are other treatment centers throughout the U.S. And, anyway, I'd become involved in that. So the torture story, when it broke after 9/11, and the Iraq War was of a lot of interest to me. So I wanted to see those confessions. But,
and isn't it right, Jeff, that, I mean, people say torture doesn't work, but that assumes your premise there. If your premise is getting the truth, then no, it doesn't work. But if you're just trying to get someone to say what you want them to say, then it works great. So in other words, the myth of the myth here has a solid foundation that if you torture an American pilot severely enough, he'll admit to anything to make the pain stop, just the same as anybody else would.
Well, that's
the same way Abu Zubaydah said that Saddam Hussein was working with Osama bin Laden.
Right. So the problem, what anybody says, whether they're being tortured or not, is a matter of the truth value of their statements is part of the art of interrogation and analyzing and what is said in interrogation. But it's a much more nuanced story than that, because, again, my first encounter with any torture victim was when I was still a trainee psychologist at a student health center in the Bay Area. And I had someone from a Latin American country, I don't want to say which country, and they had been captured and tortured, and in fact did reveal the names of some of their cohorts and comrades, and felt horrific guilt over it. And that was the reason, still years later, that they had come to see me or to see somebody to talk to about this. So, actually, the truth is, people will say false confessions, some of them, and some of them will give up actual material. In terms of the Korean War, the story becomes even more nuanced than that, because the morale of the U.S. Army was very poor, and that includes even in portions of the Air Force or Marine Air Force, Marine Air Flyers, who repeatedly have said at the time, or some of them did, such as Colonel Frank Schwabel, who was the second highest ranking POW at all in the Korean War, and the highest ranking Marine POW. That people were really upset when they learned that the U.S. was using biological warfare. Anyway, there were a spate of confessions. I finally did find them after years. Main point is, though, you're right. There has been tons of controversy for decades over whether or not there were ever germ warfare weapons were used in the Korean War, and it's kind of remained that way until in 2010, the CIA released hundreds of documents as part of a 60th anniversary of the Korean War thing, in conjunction with the Truman Library. And I stumbled upon this myself around 2015, about 5 years later. And apparently another researcher, Nicholson Baker, also came across some of these documents. And looking at them was quite shocking, because these were communications intelligence reports, highly classified, very much only need to know, higher than top, even if you have top secret clearance, you had to have special top secret clearance to see these documents. And what they were again, CIA analysts reading the reports of the predecessor of today's NSA, National Security Agency, then called the Armed Forces Security Agency, who were, of course, eavesdropping in and trying to break the codes. The cryptologists were sitting there listening to radio communications of their enemies in the communist camp, right, in North Korean and Chinese military forces, and then they were saying what they were hearing, and then they passed that on to the military and intelligence bosses who want that information. And so here we are 60 years later, and then even more 65 years later, really, so about anyone really looks at these. And what are they saying? They're saying we're being attacked by biological weapons. We need, we can't move. Our forces, if we don't get food in here. I mean, it seems like it had some successes at first, this air campaign. See, there was an air campaign that began in January of 1952, which the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Marine Corps were dropping all sorts as part of a kind of field tests of all sorts of different attempts to have biological weapons. And apparently, a lot of these weaponry came from the design of, or in fact crafted by, Japan's former biological warfare unit, people at Unit 731, Unit 100, etc., under General Shiro Ishii, who was a war criminal.
What do you mean they weren't all hanged after the war? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, the United States made an agreement. They rushed in. They got the intelligence that during World War II, the Japanese biological warfare unit was huge. It was doing tons of research, and it had already begun utilizing it in the field, killing arguably somewhere between 100 and 500,000 people in their own field trials. In other words, biological warfare attacks by plague, cholera, etc., dysentery on various population in China. And the U.S. tracked these people down, and they offered them amnesty from war crimes if they would work for Fort Detrick. In other words, work for the United States Biological Warfare Program. And I say work for, mainly they wanted them to give them their data, give them their biological samples, talk to them about the design of their weaponry. And they did all of that. And perhaps some of them, we still, went to work for the U.S. government in this capacity, because it certainly looks that way. Because from even though the U.S. had a biological warfare research program and had since World War II, it had, by the time the Korean War had come along, their grandiose idea of major of bombs, and they were designing cluster bombs and using all sorts of different scientifically derived weaponry and how to use it the way only the Pentagon can do these things. Just wasn't ready for prime time. They barely had some pilot plants going to create some of this material, with the exception of biological organisms to be used against crops. Those were ready, and they were already beginning to deploy them. In fact, they were forward deploying them against the Soviet Union in something called Project Steelyard, hardly ever talked about. Nicholson Baker, who I just mentioned a little earlier, has written about it in his book Baseless. But
and this is the guy that wrote Human Smoke, about the origins of World War II in Europe, right?
That's right.
Brilliant guy. Man, that book is something else. I just read that a few months ago. And anyway, go ahead.
It is. Yeah, he's an excellent writer too. Yes. Anyway, they forward deployed, but I found the documents. You can only rely on secondary sources so much, and you need to see the documentary material. So when I saw the documentary material, for instance, about Project Steelyard, I could see that they were forward deploying biological bombs in England and in Libya at Wheeler Air Force Base. Should be to drop on Russia. It was top secret. The biological warfare camp, the documents of which I found at least 24, specifying that, and this was of course given up by the CIA. I mean, I say given up, voluntarily posted by the CIA. I don't know that they looked that carefully, although there must be many more documents about this. So perhaps they did, and they tried to stop the leak out. I think I looked one time, I can't remember how many documents they released, something like 600 or so, and of these communications intelligence files, and only in about 25 of them or 24 had discussion of the attacks by the U.S. That's still a lot, but and certainly out of the total tonnage of bombing in Korea, which was massive, and they dropped more bombs on North Korea than they did on Europe in World War II. And, just decimated that country. So in a way, you look at the biological warfare, well, how evil is that compared to everything that was going on, the napalming, the bombing of the cities, the killing of civilian populations. But biological weapons are a special form of weapon of mass destruction. We see what's happened already, the kind of chaos society was put in when one organism, however it came about, the SARS, COVID-2, that's causing COVID-19, has caused in the world. So you can, imagine how dangerous all this biological warfare stuff is. And the pilots, they didn't like it either.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you what, I mean, this is part of the history of World War II, is that's how you know how bad the Japanese Empire was, is because this is what they did to China.
Mm-hmm.
That's what proves that we're on the side of the angels fighting against pure evil.
Yeah, well, if only it were so simple. But what the Japanese did do, of course, was truly evil.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm not trying to rationalize the Japanese. I'm just saying we're putting ourselves in the same boat with them. I mean, you read about them dropping vats of fleas infected with bubonic plague over Nanking. Like, I don't know how effective that was, but that they tried that makes them absolutely some of the worst humans who ever lived. Then Truman hired them and put them to war in Korea.
Yes. Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Pretty much what happened. And the reason they did this, of course, was this. Some of your listeners may, the history of the Korean War isn't widely known. It was just known that it happened. But very briefly, for your listeners who don't know, in 1950, I mean, there had been border battles going on between the 38th parallel, North and South Korea, for some months, if not even a few years, between the two regimes, one initially set up with the support of the Soviet Union and the other set up with the support of the United States, one capitalist and the other nominally socialist or communist. And finally, the war, full-scale war broke out.
And by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but let me just tell people real quick so you guys can, put this issue to bed real quick. Who really started the Korean War? By Justin Raimondo. From July 2013. Forget the Trumanite mythology, he says. And this is the true story. America and the South started it. And of course, then just pretended that history began yesterday when the North invaded the South.
Oh yeah. If anything, it was a defense. It was either invade or be invaded. And in fact, they already were beginning their south invasion and they were slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people. Anyone who even smelled of being a leftist in South Korea was being gunned down or imprisoned.
And this was
And
essentially the
pretty
Vichy
awful.
government that had served Japan during the occupation. And then the Americans.
Absolutely. Yes.
Huh?
America came in and set up a military government. They ran the United States in South Korea for a couple of years after World War II. Then they turned it over. Oh, and in that process, they repressed the localized people's republics that were being set up and governments after the Japanese who had colonized Korea were forced to flee and were defeated. And anyways, and it's a tremendous story in and of itself. Bottom line for your listeners is to go back to I was talking about the Korean War. The United States was the Koreans came in, they swept the South Korean army aside. The Americans came back and counterattacked it with a big invasion at Incheon. They were pushing the North Koreans back to the Chinese border. Then the Chinese came in to the aid of the North Koreans and swept the Americans back across the 38th parallel, back and forth. Seoul itself was occupied and reoccupied by different forces 4 or 5 times in a matter of a year. So in the context of these defeats, when the United States was being rolled back by the Chinese, for instance, they started thinking about weapons of mass destruction. They thought about nukes, but Soviet Union had recently exploded atomic weaponry, and they were kind of afraid of that. So the idea was that biological weapons could sow chaos and destruction in the rear and destroy the supply lines. That was the whole idea of the Chinese and North Koreans in Korea. It didn't work for the most part, and there could be a whole story written about that. But people have, in fact, written about the massive public health campaigns. Even in my own reporting on this, looking at the documents, you can from the intelligence reports, you can. There's an episode where North Korean health officials go out to investigate charges of an attack by biological weapons, and they say no, this wasn't an attack. This was a false alarm. This was, flies in a manure pile of manure, and so they were concerned about determining what the extent of the attack was, what they were being attacked with, what treatments worked well. They needed to educate the troops. It's all a fascinating story, and I've written about it. What you called me on here today to talk about, of course, was the aftermath. So it's the Chinese and the North Koreans.
I'm sorry to jump in here again, Jeff, but I just wanted to reiterate that the real key here, as you were saying there, because there's a lot of information about an obscure topic here. I just want to make sure people are caught up. The real breakthrough here was you and these other authors too. You got your hands on the CIA reports of them reading the proto-NSA eavesdropping of Korean radio transmissions, where in real time they're saying, oh my God, we're being attacked by germs. And so there's essentially not much room for interpretation here as far as the CIA. Whoever wrote up these documents was essentially just a stenographer taking notes on what they were getting from these electronic intercepts. There's not much spin involved anywhere in here. The only thing that's noticeable or notable about it is that they were kept top secret for so long, and they finally were released.
Right, or at least some of them were finally released.
And then there are more. Is it just absolutely silly to say that? Well, maybe the Koreans were just pretending because they knew they were being eavesdropped on, this kind of thing. It's worth bringing up, I guess.
Of course, they didn't know they were being eavesdropped. They were always doing countermeasures. It would be as if, they put aside they would have had to put aside their own defensive measures to stop the U.S. military from eavesdropping on their military communications. In every war, this is going on, right? It's called signals intelligence or communications intelligence, and there's a cat and mouse game, and I've written about this, and so even has the CIA, about how back and forth, sometimes they would be able to get the communications and sometimes they wouldn't because of effective countermeasures by the communists. And so you would have to imagine that if they wanted to seed all their military communications with tales of biological warfare for propaganda purposes that were never released for decades, it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't pass the smell test. No, these are real communications. In fact, no historian and no member of the government, no commentator at all has, since I've been writing about this, since I first published it a couple of years ago, has stepped forward to say that I was wrong. And here's why. Not one. And I've written to tons of people behind the scenes. They go, "Oh, Jeff, no, it's got to be this, it's got to be that." No one will, and I shoot them down. And no one has dared come public because they know that it's absurd. It's like saying the emperor has no clothes, right? And everyone finally sees that, and then someone else comes out and go, "No, I see clothes there." No, there aren't. This was biological warfare. Mm-hmm. The total dimensions of it aren't totally known. And, everything that happened in regards to it, obviously a lot is still secret, but we do know that it happened.
Give me just a minute here. At the Libertarian Institute, we publish books, real good ones. So far, we've got Will Grigg's No Quarter, Sheldon Richman's Coming to Palestine, and What Social Animals Owe to Each Other, and 4 of mine, Fool's Errand, Enough Already, The Great Ron Paul, and my brand new one, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And I'm happy to announce that we've just published our managing editor Keith Knight's first one, The Voluntarist Handbook, an excellent collection of essays by the world's greatest libertarian thinkers and writers, including me. Check them all out at libertarianinstitute.org/books. And for a limited time, signed copies of Enough Already and Hotter Than the Sun are available at scotthorton.org/books. Hey guys, I had some wasps in my house, so I shot them to death with my trusty Bug Assault 3.0 model with the improved salt reservoir and bar safety. I don't have a deal with them, but the show does earn a kickback every time you get a Bug Assault or anything else you buy from Amazon.com by way of the link in the right-hand margin on the front page at scotthorton.org. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about the mess. Your wife will clean it up. This is the key to understanding all these other pieces of information we had about it. Like, for example, the confessions of these pilots who they said, they were tortured or even completely brainwashed, right? MK Ultra, mind control, mind slave, right. Completely hypnotized, inhuman takeovers of their brain. Isn't this where the term brainwashing comes from? And that it was really used.
A CIA term. Yes.
Yeah.
They invented the term. Edward Hunter, one of their contract kind of journalists, invented the term brainwashing.
And we use it colloquially now, but the way they meant it then was as though this was actually possible to completely wash someone's brain and completely rewire them and make them this kind of automaton, like in The Manchurian Candidate, right?
Right, and it was their dream, and the CIA was working hard on this even before MK Ultra. At the time of the Korean War, the project that they were using was called Artichoke, Project Artichoke, renamed from an earlier Project Bluebird and all this stuff. Even the military was experimenting with their own stuff in the late 40s called Project Chatter. All of these things were about finding chemical and psychological and psychiatric and sometimes physical means to break down a human being's psyche and to implant, if they could, other information in their brains, to create amnesias. This is still something of great interest to I could go into to the CIA to this day, as revealed in as came out in some of the documents around I think we've talked about this in the past, from the enhanced interrogation program, where acolytes of the CIA in modern times and following that were very interested in the idea of creating amnesias in people. But anyway, so what they did, so there was, the propaganda that the Soviets and the Chinese and the North Koreans were putting out was kind of effective. And it also caught the attention of some very mainstream establishment figures. And peace forces around the world were beginning to take notice as well. There were, the dean, the second-ranking member of the Anglican Church in England, had gone to China to check it out. Said he saw the stuff happening. Talked to tons of people. These are establishment church people, right? And they were telling him about the biological warfare. And he came back to England, and thousands of people were coming to see him. The same with another missionary who returned, a Canadian missionary who returned to Canada, and 8,000 people came out to hear him speak in Toronto, in 1952. And so the U.S. government was, hearing all of this stuff, and they worried about the effects of the truth coming out about the biological warfare. This was a major war crime, right? In the U.S., we're supposed to be the good guys, right? And this was a vicious war. So what happened was the propaganda just wasn't working. They wanted other countries to do things for them, and it just wasn't working. Even U.S. scientists, they went to the head of the what is it, the National Science Board or whatever it was called. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it right now in the U.S. But his name was Devin Bronk, Bronk, and he was a top U.S. scientist. And they said, you've got to write something about this, about how this report put out by chaired by the famous British scientist Joseph Needham was just a bunch of hooey, and it's no good scientifically. And he wrote something up, but it was so weak and so milquetoasty, they couldn't even use it. And why? Because it was good science. And they had interviewed hundreds of people, and they'd gone to sites. Even today, that report, the internet, by an organization called the International Scientific Commission, is belittled and lies are said about it. So the U.S. government has done its best to hide, dissemble, manufacture false information about, and now we're talking about something even worse, because the document I found, which was called the Basic Plan for U.S. Action to Destroy and Counter-Exploit the Soviet Bacteriological Warfare Myth, in which such document talked about neutralizing, right, and overwriting and destroying so-called propaganda instrumentalities. But in another part of the document, which later was suppressed and rewritten, they talked about the urgent need to attack persons and groups who had bought into this myth, the myth being that biological weaponry was used. And in fact, within a few weeks after this report came out, a dissident apparently within the Fort Detrick itself, Frank Olson, a name I'm sure many people are aware of, was murdered precisely because he was a security risk. Not only did he reportedly disagree with some of the horrific experiments that were going on at that time around this MK Ultra artichoke kind of interrogation, which involved the murder, even reportedly, of some prisoners in Europe, but also he had been working in the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick on the biological warfare stuff. And as I said, a lot of people within the military weren't happy about what was going on with the biological warfare. In fact, my previous article to this, the one where I discussed Project Steelyard, I was surprised to come across where the head of the American biological warfare effort, which is run through the Army, Army's Chemical Corps, it was called, at Fort Detrick, a guy by the name of General Boline, wrote a note to the Secretary of the Army in late 1951, December of 1951, saying, what's going on here? You're cutting our special funding, our special secret funding at this crucial time. We need to have this. What in the hell are you doing? And in fact, they did reinstitute the secret funding for them. By secret funding, I mean, it was outside of normal appropriations or appropriations that you get to finance your military or spy stuff. This was special pipeline that went through to get what they needed. But if someone at the munitions board of the U.S. Army, and I think this was the kind of bureaucratic stuff that was crap that was being thrown up against to slow down the biological warfare effort, because I think some people were against it inside the Army. I mean, when I say the Army, I mean, the military in general. And so with no explanation at all, on the very eve of what we now know was the beginning of the larger scale field testing and bombing with using biological weapons that began in either late December or early January 1952 or late December 1951. Suddenly the appropriations to make a secret, the secret funding that they were getting to do this was being withheld from them. That was put back, but I think it's symbolic of not just symbolic, it's indicative of the kinds of internal conflict that was going on around the biological warfare, which is, if you look at the kind of even the documentation we still have from that time, it's quite evident. As one high Air Force official told an Air Force historian writing up this history of what went on only a few years later in the mid-50s, said, no one came out of the biological warfare program smelling like a rose. And,
In other words,
lawyers.
he's admitting they'd all killed innocent people. Nice way to say that. Yeah.
So this plan. I'm sure people are familiar with COINTELPRO. This was the FBI, but also CIA was involved at times. And a campaign to disrupt and destroy, dissident factions within the United States. Whether it was aimed against the civil rights movement, it was aimed against the Communist Party at that time, also the Socialist Workers' Party, the two largest, socialist or ostensible communist groups in the United States at that time in the 50s. It was aimed against the American Indian movement. It was aimed against individuals like Martin Luther King, and arguably involved assassination. I mean, during the Church Committee hearings, there were discussions about assassination units, et cetera, that run by the CIA, and the story of how they, so this was about repressing the information, and it's probably been, unless you want to think about the JFK stuff, but since the biological warfare campaign was much larger than whatever even the conspiracy was in terms of what was involved in doing it than anything around JFK. I mean, you had a massive military campaign that involved, people training and delivering weaponry and experimenting with how to use it and training you how to use it and covering up the use. There were a number of people involved, hundreds and hundreds of people who were involved in this, biological warfare campaign. And one thing they did, so I've been mapping how this was all covered up. And I think it's very instructive for people today, because the kind of ways in which the U.S. did this are the same ways they continue to do it. I just mentioned COINTELPRO, but continue even to this day. By throwing into disrepute the critics of the U.S. government one way or another, or eliminating them or removing them if they can, if that's what's necessary. And so really this was the beginning, in a sense, in my way of thinking, to COINTELPRO. So one thing they did, and I've documented this, is they, and in fact, this began with the beginning of the Korean War. The United States government instituted a program in which they, first of all, they had to stop information flow from happening from other parts of the world, particularly communist parts of the world. In those days, we're talking about, Soviet Union and China, basically, and North Korea. And what they did is they instituted a massive mail interception program, so that all but first-class mail, which was subject to being opened, that was a different program. They were opening people's mail. But I'm talking about the destruction of material sent by mail, which is in those days what you did: newspapers from abroad, magazines, journals, films, records, etc., audio records, in which, to make sure that nothing came in, and hundreds of thousands of pieces of media material coming from so-called Iron Curtain countries were being destroyed every month for years, for decades, until it took it to the Supreme Court to declare that illegal in 1965 before it actually really ended. So we're talking about 15 years of destruction. So that was one way they did this. They destroyed, they kept people in the United States from having getting the information. They suborned a certain percentage of the journalist class in America and made them either assets of the CIA or outright CIA or FBI agents. They and then, of course, there were the dirty tricks and things that you would do. There was the COINTELPRO. And there was just a massive overt propaganda campaign of setting what the narrative would be. And that's what's all laid out, if you go back to 1953, in this national plan to combat the Soviet bacteriological warfare myth, of which the basic plan, which broke down, they had a national plan which really broke down into two sub-plans. One plan was aimed against destroying those propagating the idea that the U.S. had used biological warfare. And the other program was a plan to promote and make sure everybody knew about how barbaric the Soviets were and what they were doing to the prisoners of war in Korea, and using that as propaganda. Particularly, it was to change the POW narrative, because the POW narrative, coming from the bacteriological or biological warfare material, was that U.S. prisoners were telling in quite a lot of detail. By the way, you finally can, and today you can read the confessions. You can see they're quite detailed. They're very, people of different ranks write about only what they know. So the lower ranked people write about their, as they experienced it. Somebody who, was a navigator in a plane versus what they were instructed to do versus the guy who was in charge of armaments, and talked about his responsibilities and where they got the weaponry and how it came into the country. And a separate person from the top, at the top levels where they caught a couple of top guys talking about the discussions in the Pentagon, discussion among generals about what they would do. So these were, where the bombers took off from, how they understood the campaign, how they wanted to drop a string of biological weapons basically across the peninsula in something called Operation Strangle. Actually, there was something called Operation Strangle. They wanted it was part of Operation Strangle to cut off totally supplies from the north coming down to fighters in the 38th parallel and below. And they wanted to put a string of and they did, in fact, a campaign. They dropped biological weapons across the peninsula. Different how that was allocated. Anyway, if I was talking about all this, you and I, Scott, back in 1954, we would have been targets. Right in the crosshairs of the CIA, who was given the covert operational responsibility for being the people to destroy in any covert actions that were going to come out of this. Mm-hmm. Actions that were, when they get a progress report a month later about how the CIA was proceeding about, what they were, not a month later, 2 months later, about this basic plan to destroy and counter-exploit the myth, the so-called myth, the CIA guy reporting to something called the President Eisenhower's Operations Coordinating Board, which was high-level organization. Earlier, it had been called the Psychological Strategy Board. This was made up of the director of the CIA and, top undersecretaries of state and defense and certain other people occasionally sitting in, so they could coordinate their so-called psychological warfare efforts. The psychological warfare was everything, from their standpoint, was everything from dropping leaflets on people to dropping germ bombs on people. And also all of this fake propaganda and false stories that were laid out there, which of today, almost 90%, obviously not at antiwar.com, by the way, but most of what you read in the mainstream media, of course, a lot of this is washed through, CIA psychological warfare units that tell us what the news is. That's why everyone suddenly, has the same line on the news every time. Yeah. I mean, it's so blatant. It's funny.
Hey, y'all, you should sign up for my Substack. It's scotthortonshow.substack.com. And if you do that, you'll get the interviews a day before everybody else. But not only that, they'll be free of commercials. How do you like that? Pretty good, huh? scotthortonshow.substack.com. Hey, y'all, libertasbella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs, too. That's libertasbella.com. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. I'm the director. Then we've got Sheldon Richman, Kyle Anzalone, Keith Knight, Lori Calhoun, Jim Bovard, Connor Freeman, Will Porter, Patrick McFarlane, and Tommy Salmons on our staff, writing and podcasting. And we've also got a ton of other great writers, too, like Walter Block, Richard Booth, Boss Spleet, Kim Robinson, and William Van Wagenen. We've published 8 books so far, including my latest, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and Keith Knight's new Voluntarist Handbook. And we've got quite a few more great ones coming soon. Check out libertarianinstitute.org/books. It's a whole new era. We libertarians don't have the power, but we do have enough influence to try to lead the left and the right to make things right. Join us at libertarianinstitute.org. I one time met a guy who was Army intelligence who said, listen, everything in the news goes through us first. You don't read anything in there that we didn't decide to leak to the Times or the Post or the whoever, which I'm sure is overstated, but I'm sure is not very overstated. No, there's a lot of that, has to be.
Right. Yes. Oh, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a lot of it. I don't think it's 100% because that would be incredible. That would be a true totalitarian society. So things leak through, and there's a lot of paranoia about this and that, all the stuff's happening at Twitter. But I've been able to do what I do, and I've not, maybe because I'm still small potatoes, or maybe because I've done I'd like to think it's because I've done a kind of I think, ironclad job in documenting everything I do. Everything I do. When I publish an article, as I did on this thing about the U.S. plan to destroy people and groups that were pushing the biological warfare story back in the mid 1950s, I post the document. You could read it yourself. Maybe Jeff Kaye's wrong. Maybe he's full of shit. Let's read it ourselves. Let's read this other document, right? Everything is there so that people can make up their minds themselves. Of course, the mainstream academia normally don't do that. And they're afraid to do it. Instead, they just, pronounce their propaganda line and go with it. So this is all very important, I want to say, of course, because, anybody, I know Ukraine, outside the United States, the Ukraine war gets, rightly so, I think, the lion's share of the attention. But in East Asia, the Korean Peninsula, it's still extremely, the Korean War never truly ended. It was just an armistice. And
they're just some missile tests, Speaking of in another context, yeah, I mean, they have George W. Bush pushed North Korea to nukes, and then Bush and Obama and Trump kind of tried a bit, but brought John Bolton with him, so much for that. And then Biden has kept the Bush and Obama policy of refusing to negotiate in good faith with them whatsoever to try to resolve it. Yeah. They would prefer to have North Korea as an enemy. As a potential enemy.
The Second Korean War is really something to be feared. The First Korean War was already unbelievably destructive, even in terms of Korea, but it wouldn't be confined to the Korean Peninsula, I don't believe, anymore. And of course, even the First Korean War wasn't, because in fact the United States was bombing with conventional bombs and germ bombs, portions of China near the North Korean border and area of Manchuria. So actually the Korean War had, in fact, led into part of China already. But a second Korean War, especially since North Korea has nuclear weapons, it seems to me would not be confined anymore to just Korea. And I believe that Kim Jong-un is saying the truth when he says the U.S. would pay a very, very, very heavy price for attacking North Korea. And so I don't want to see there be war at all, and I believe that...
No, James Mattis said if we go to war in Korea, it'll be the bitterest fighting of our lifetimes. And he was including Vietnam in that when he said that.
Yes, that's right. It would be. And that, and it would be, that conflict will definitely come to U.S. shores in the forms of bombs. And, it would be, it would be hard to believe that it would not, in fact, end up turning into World War III.
And Jeff, I mean, they really were proposing, H.R. McMaster, especially in the Trump years, was pushing force strikes on Korea. It's the bloody nose strategy. What we'll do is we'll just decimate their nuclear weapons program, but not anything else. And then we'll just tell them, yep, that's right. You better just lay there and take it. Otherwise, we could expand our list of targets, if you know what I mean. And that was his strategy, was that we'll just bomb the living crap out of one part of their government, and the rest of their government will just sit there and take it because they'll know better than to make us actually angry. And, we really came that close to a war, which very well could have included nuclear weapons. They could nuke Japan, if maybe Hawaii, if not the mainland. They claim that... I mean, their rockets have not gone this far, but they've demonstrated, it all depends on the arc of the launch, but they've gone high enough. And
they've gone high enough that they could. I mean,
to show that they could have hit D.C., even America's East Coast.
Yeah, and they certainly could hit the West Coast. And
again, you know what? I have to say this, Jeff. I'm sorry. Forgive me because... forgive me. It's the 20th anniversary, and I can't let it go. This is all John Bolton's fault. He falsely accused him of having a uranium enrichment program when they had bought some old aluminum tubes from Pakistan, but they weren't doing nothing. And he used that to break the agreed framework. Then they put new sanctions. Then they announced the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was their claimed right to seize North Korean boats on the high seas. And then they put them in the Nuclear Posture Review on the short list for a nuclear first strike. And only then did Kim Jong-il, in December of 2002, announce that he was going in 6 months to withdraw from the NPT, kick the inspectors out of the country, and start making nuclear weapons, which is exactly what he did. And now he's got at least a couple of dozen of them. His son does. At least a couple of dozen of them. And that is 100% the fault of George W. Bush and John Bolton and Dick Cheney and their policy, as much as it's the responsibility of Kim Jong-il himself for, taking them up on their provocation the way that he did. And so I just hate to have this subject brought up without taking the opportunity to damn those men for what they did.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Although I can't almost see anybody, American, with oddly enough the exception perhaps of Trump for a small window of time. But I sometimes wonder what Trump was doing. If he wanted peace, he's not. Trump is not. Whatever one thinks about Donald Trump, he's not a totally dumb man. He may not be a genius, but he's not a dumb man either. And he certainly knew who John Bolton was. So why he took Bolton there and kind of allowed this to happen, I don't know. To the derailment of some kind of peace process taking place. But in this,
I think he surely didn't know the history that I just rattled off. There is the problem that he knew the guy's tough, but he didn't know that. Like, oh, wait a minute, I get it. You've got a real chip on your shoulder on North Korea, a very specific one. He probably didn't know that, and there probably wasn't anybody around to tell him. By the way, this guy hates North Korea more than anyone else in America, so you should probably leave him at home. In fact, the second time that they went, I forget which was which, Singapore or Vietnam was first or second, but the second time, I think in Singapore, he sent Bolton literally to outer Mongolia at the same time to keep him away. Lesson learned the hard way, but by then it was too late.
Too late, yeah. Well, I don't know that, it's kind of like the Zelensky in the U.S. about Russia, and today the Americans towards Vietnam. The whole issue of denuclearization means you get rid of all your nukes the way Gaddafi did, and maybe we'll talk about them.
Right.
Or it's like Zelensky saying, Russia, you withdraw from everything that you've done, going back to
unconditional surrender.
And
right.
Maybe we'll talk. Yeah, that's our way of negotiating. Right, exactly. Negotiation means you unconditionally surrender or disarm, and then we'll talk.
Well, and speaking of which,
nobody was going to do that.
I learned this from MASH when I was a kid. My mom always watched MASH when she was making dinner. And I remember when Ike Eisenhower got elected, all the guys were really excited that maybe he's going to end the war now, which is what happened, right? But so take me back and refresh my memory on when he was inaugurated and what his policy was. Did it change? And especially, did it change in regards to using germ weapons on these poor people?
No, it did not. Of course, he was inaugurated in January of 1953, right? The election was in 52, and Eisenhower, who supposedly understood that there was a lot of fatigue in the country. And by the way, we know now the morale of the troops in Korea was not great. They didn't, one of the documents I came across, this wasn't a major part of my story by any means, but when they got the first prisoners were returned in something called the Little Switch in March of 1953. Of course, Eisenhower would be getting those reports about what they were finding from the debriefings of the first POWs, is that most of these people thought there was little sense in the war. They didn't understand why they were there, and they believed the biological warfare charges of the communists. Although, interestingly enough, they believed it and they thought it was okay. They thought, we should do that in a war. We should use every weapon we have. So, but the main point is, though, that they were demoralized. And in the U.S. on the battlefield wasn't doing so great. They were just barely holding their own. And that was with, the participation of the British, the Australians, South Koreans, of course, and other units, other people who they called the Allies, right? The UN.
It was UN forces, right? Because the Soviet Union boycotted the vote on the UNSC. So this is the first UN war and the first, completely, major undeclared war.
Well, the United Nations Command, which was created in 1950, UNC, still exists today. They have a website. You can go to it. This is the UN command that was set up to fight North Korea, still exists. It was never demobilized.
Yeah, and people might remember in the 1990s, American POWs, bodies were sent home in UN flag draped coffins, and people were so upset about that, which really is just the American empire dressed up in baby blue is all that is anyway. People should understand that. But at the same time, you see why people are like, wait a minute, whose empire are we serving? If it ain't our flag, it's some higher authority than ours. What in the hell? And of course, they hadn't declared war since, based on Truman's precedent. I learned when I was a kid. Why isn't George H.W. Bush? How come he's saying he doesn't need a declaration of war? Oh, because he has a UN Security Council resolution. Huh? But the Constitution doesn't say that. And I knew that just as a kid. I was for the war because I didn't care, but I was against the violation of the Constitution. And I knew that Congress voting to authorize it was not the same thing, that they were essentially letting the president decide, which is not how it's supposed to be. And in concert with foreign powers, the president, in agreement with France and Britain and whoever, they decide. They're our Congress now to decide whether we get into a war? Yep. Except when they won't, and then we just do a coalition of the willing or NATO or whatever we want instead.
Yeah. Right, and that's how it goes. Or just the U.S. goes alone, whatever the thing may be.
Yeah.
I think this is the whole Korean War issue, and particularly the biological weapons. First of all, I think your listeners have to understand this is the most suppressed story in U.S. history. The reason I keep coming up with stuff is because it's like an open field. If you're going to be an investigative reporter, if you're going to investigate stuff and tell the truth, and find the documentary material, even though a lot of it was destroyed or suppressed, there's still plenty out there as I've discovered, that you can pick up that was left on the field or snuck through FOIA, etc. And what you're seeing is the true parameters of the U.S. National security state as it was being born out of World War II, and with the massive acceleration with the Cold War, and the Cold War really got going with the Korean War. That was when the Cold War became a hot war. That was when the CIA grew massively during the Korean War. The CIA is all over this kind of stuff, and the military too. And you can see that there's a lot more interplay between the military and the CIA. If we ever get the full parameters on the biological warfare story, it in fact will be very instructive to see exactly how the CIA and the military interacted. I just discovered that there was a unit called the joint something that I found in one of the documents. I noted it in the story where there's a special Pentagon unit whose job is to give Pentagon or Department of Defense assets to the CIA when it needs them for its covert actions. So they operate very closely together. Mm-hmm. And of course, the whole evolution of the Special Forces units and Special Forces Command, et cetera, that took place since the Korean War and up through Vietnam, et cetera, to present day, is also part of that story. I think people need to start demanding that the information, there's a whole thing in the press right now because some of the documents in the JFK Assassination Committee aren't being still produced and withheld by the CIA, and that still makes headlines. It still manages to make the news. But what I've written about, it doesn't make the news at all. I mean, that's not true of antiwar.com, but for the vast majority of people don't know about this. To the degree they do, they believe, as I did at the start of this, that there was some kind of commie brainwashing torture thing that went on and made people confess to crazy stuff 70 years ago. And that's a story from 70 years ago. It has no relationship to now. Yeah. But in fact,
it's just like movie tone news. Whenever you watch old newsreels, you're like, geez, pretty blatant propaganda, all the trumpets in the background and everything. It's so stupid. So anybody with a 21st century media mind looking back at the claims from back then, obviously it's pretty easy to see right through what they're doing in a way that, less sophisticated people back then would not have been able to tell. But listen, we're just right out of time. But that last little bit of yours made me wonder whether you had ever teamed up with your old buddy Jason Leopold to do a full FOIA onslaught on this and try to get more.
No, I haven't. His career kind of went in a different direction than mine, and his interests went in a different direction.
Russiagate, trutherism, and all the rest of that. I know.
Yeah. So really not. I think he follows me and I follow him, but we haven't really teamed up anything like that. There's a little cooperation still around the Guantanamo story. A few times he, gave me access to some photos that he had, and
you know what? I bet he'd do you the favor of helping you out on some FOIA stuff if he's that good at it.
Yeah.
It might be worth a try. I still love the guy. What can I say, man? I know him from a long time ago, and he's had some really terrible failures, but he's done some good stuff too. And I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Listen, I'm sorry, I'm out of time here, dude. I gotta run. But thank you so much for doing this show and for your attention to this important story, this real history that someday is going to be included in the history, probably in great measure due to your work. So thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks.
All right, you guys, that is Jeffrey Kaye. Check him out at Medium. It's jeff-k.medium.com. Secret plan revealed. CIA told to destroy those supporting communist germ warfare myth, which was not one. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.